This is a special bonus episode of the Orthodox Conundrum. I'm Scott Kahn. Last Thursday, Cardinal Robert Prevost of Chicago became Pope Leo XIV. While Jews may believe that this shouldn't matter to us at all, this is most likely false. The Pope commands the allegiance of well over 1 billion Roman Catholics worldwide, and his ability to help shape their opinions about the Jewish people and about Israel should not be underestimated. To discuss what his election means for the Jewish people, and to review his predecessor, Pope Francis's record towards Jews and the Jewish state, I was honored to speak to Dr. Malka Simkovich. Malka has an interesting vantage point, as she is not only a well-known expert in Jewish-Christian relations, but she also spent 10 years as the chair of Jewish studies at the Catholic Theological Union, which is where the Pope studied in the early 1980s. This Tuesday night, the Orthodox Conundrum podcast will release a regular episode, co-produced with Intimate Judaism, about how parents should talk about sex and intimacy with their kids. So look for that episode 48 hours after this bonus episode drops. Dr. Malka Simkovich is the editor-in-chief of the Jewish Publication Society and visiting professor at Yeshiva University's Revel Graduate School for Jewish Studies. Her first book, The Making of Jewish Universalism From Exile to Alexandria, was published in 2016, and her second book, Discovering Second Temple Literature, The Scriptures and Stories That Shaped Early Judaism, was published with JPS in 2018 and received the 2019 AJL Judaica Reference Honor Award. Her third book, Letters from Home, The Creation of Diaspora in Jewish Antiquity, was published in June 2024. A Leon Charney Fellow at the Yeshiva University Center for Israel Studies, a Sachs Scholar for the Rabbi Jonathan Sachs Foundation, and a Research Fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute, Malka served as the Crown Ryan Chair of Jewish Studies at Catholic Theological Union from 2014 to 2024, and speaks regularly to audiences across North America and beyond on topics related to the Hebrew Bible, Jewish history, and contemporary Jewish-Christian relations. Dr. Malka Simkovich, thank you very much for joining me today on this bonus episode of the Orthodox Conundrum podcast.
Thank you for having me, Scott. Good to see you.
I'd like to ask you about the new Pope, Robert Prevost, now known as Leo XIV. Malka, you were the Crown Ryan Chair of Jewish Studies at Catholic Theological Union in Chicago from 2014 to 2024, which is the same school where the Pope received a Master's of Divinity degree in 1982. That means that you missed him by over 30 years. Nevertheless, I would guess that there are some people there, and some people that you know who are there, who still remember him. So given that, what do we now know about Pope Leo XIV?
You know, Scott, in the scope of religious history, 40 years is just a drop in the bucket. Really, if you think about it, we overlapped because our religious history is at least 2 millennia. So as far as I'm concerned, not to be too heretical, but we're colleagues. I'm just joking. We're really not. I only have one colleague at Catholic Theological Union who remembers Robert Prevost, now Pope Leo XIV. And that's Father John Polakowski, who taught him, like you said, in the early 80s. I'm not sure how many details Father John remembers, but he has done a few interviews, including with, I think, the Jerusalem Post, where he remembers Pope Leo XIV as being a very bright and eager young seminarian. But I don't know that we're big on the details. It has been a few decades.
I mean, not to sound cynical here, Malka, but bright and eager, that's about as anodyne a description as you could possibly make.
Look, if you ask me to describe my students from 5 years ago, as lovely as they were, probably the adjective that I would use is eager and bright. Honestly, there are so many students that come and go. I don't want to be disrespectful. I think he probably was all those things and more. But, you know, it's easy to say in hindsight that this is someone who is going places. The truth is that the selection of this Pope was a surprise, I think, to many within and without the church. I think that this is an unexpected, again, at least from my outsider vantage point, I think it was pretty unexpected.
In that case, let's leave Catholic Theological Union, where you used to teach, behind. What does anybody in the United States know about this particular Pope?
Well, you know, there are tidbits that are easily available. At first, I think that there was a shock that this is a person who grew up in Chicago, who still has siblings in North America. Pretty soon on, the news cycle kind of switched the narrative. And now, you know, he's not the Pope of North America. He's the Pope of the Americas. He spent the majority of his decade in Peru. He is not just bilingual or even trilingual. I think that he speaks many languages. And he as well, it seems, has kind of downplayed his North American identity In recent speeches, he's spoken often of his heritage that's European, his grandparents being immigrants to America from Spain and I think from Italy. And so he himself has a kind of a global positioning that actually does honor the kind of, I think, more global interests of his predecessor, Pope Francis.
Okay. It's interesting that we're talking about Pope Leo on the Orthodox Conundrum podcast, a Jewish podcast, and some people listening may be puzzled that we should care what the Pope thinks about. But there are probably issues that do matter to Jewish people. So even if we do not know that much about this particular Pope, what are some of the major issues that Jewish people should care about when it comes to the Pope's opinions?
Well, that's a great question. And I think the reason why it's so complicated, Scott, is because the legacy of Pope Francis is very complicated and I would say open-ended. There's no consensus. There's a lot of debate about how to understand the legacy of Pope Francis when it comes to the Jews. A lot of pain, I would say, and maybe a sense on both sides of misunderstanding one another. And so because we are still kind of processing and analyzing that tenure, it's very hard then to say, okay, well, here's the agenda that Pope Leo XIV needs to take on. We don't quite, I would say, again, from my anecdotal experience and my vantage point, we don't quite know where we stand. On the one hand, Pope Francis expressed profound and I think sincere friendship with the Jewish people. On the other hand, especially after October 7th, statements were made that the Jewish community within and without Israel found to be nothing short of shocking. The association that Francis seemed to have sanctioned between Palestinian suffering and the suffering of Jesus was, I think, a source of confusion and befuddlement and sorrow on the part of many in the Jewish community. On the other hand, there were speeches where Pope Francis expressed not just friendship with the Jewish community, but an affirmation that the Catholic-Jewish relationship is actually unique and needs to stay that way and should enjoy special protections. And that therefore the criticism which comes from the papal office comes from a position of enduring and non-negotiable friendship. So really, the legacy of Pope Francis has become a kind of a Rorschach test, I think, for Jews who are in the dialogue. And depending on whether you have an optimistic nature or a realistic or, pragmatic nature, you kind of see what you're going to see. But it's a complex legacy. And I would say that makes it different from John Paul II. The truth is, Pope Benedict also had a little bit of a complex legacy with the Jews, but that is a little different. That complexity comes from his difficult theological writings. So in any case, these things, they change from papacy to papacy. So this is a Pope who seems to be following in the legacy of Pope Francis. But as an American, I do think as a North American, we have reason to be very optimistic that he will express, I think, interest in a meaningful and substantive relationship with the Jewish community, despite the fact, and here's the concern, he doesn't yet have a real track record in that regard.
We're going to come back to Pope Francis's legacy before we finish, because I think that's a very important issue. Before we go there, though, I want to ask a little more about what I just asked in slightly different terms. Who cares? In other words, as Jews, the Pope is not our leader, obviously. Catholics can care deeply about what the Pope says, but why should Jews care about what the Pope says and thinks? Once upon a time, the Pope was the leader, the king in a sense, of a temporal domain, the Papal States, and his rulings were law for Jews, and therefore what he said mattered deeply. But today, when that effectively is no longer true, why should Jews care, or should they care, about the Pope's opinions?
I think people should care, absolutely. And there are a number of reasons for this. I mean, first of all, anyone who cares about the rise of anti-Semitism, I don't like to link the value of interreligious dialogue with anti-Semitism, but let's start with that. I would venture to guess that 99% of Jews think that the subject of anti-Semitism is an important subject that matters to them. There are over 1 billion Catholics. We are in a moment right now where I think we're on the precipice of a new era in history, in world history, in Jewish history. The Catholic Church is very polarized, and also I think on the cusp of a new era. What it will look like, nobody knows. But I say that not only because of the new papacy, but because of demographic shifts that are happening right now in the Catholic Church, where north of the equator, I think I remember talking to you about this way back when, Scott, in some other podcast, but maybe not. But north of the equator, the Catholic Church is shrinking in Europe and in North America, and it's growing and thriving in new ways in regions that are south of the equator, in Southeast Asia, in African countries, and in South America. And these are not regions where there are many Jews. And so we have a situation where we're not progressively building upon the work of dialogue that has happened before us. In other words, we're not scaffolding upon the progress that was made in the wake of the Second Vatican Council. In a way, we're running in place, or maybe even going backwards, because new generations of Catholics are entering their work not having encountered living Judaism, and also not having any particular awareness of what the Second Vatican Council was and how the Church attempted to right its past sins and reconcile with the Jewish people. So who cares what the Pope thinks? Well, like you said, the Pope is watched. The Pope is a model for not millions, but 1 billion people or even more. It matters very much because he's setting a certain standard. I would even say more than a religious standard, maybe even a moral standard, because people are paying attention even outside of the church. And we want public figures to say, we're going to take a public stand against Jew hatred and cultivate meaningful relationships that are, I would say, mutually beneficial, but not just in a transactional way, in a way that enriches both sides. So, I think it's a little cheap. It's a little crass to say we should enter into the dialogue so that they don't kill us. But on the other hand, we should enter into the dialogue so that we ensure the safety and well-being of our communities. And many people will find that dialogue enriching and even strengthening in terms of their own identities, I think.
I'd like to talk a little bit about Francis's legacy now. You've mentioned that he has expressed very strong solidarity with the Jewish people. He's expressed the importance and unique nature of the Jewish-Catholic relationship. And there seems to me to be a tremendous disconnect between that statement and those statements and all of the negative statements he's made about Israel's actions in Gaza since October 7th, 2023. One thing that sticks out in my mind, is just one example, is this past Christmas season, there was a nativity scene in the Vatican that had a keffiyeh on it, which seems to imply the canard that Jesus was Palestinian. Francis didn't make that nativity scene, but things in the Vatican, I assume, only happen with his approval, or at least with his implicit approval. So that is an example of something that's very, very troubling to me. And on some level, it sounds like, at least to me, that he may be separating Israel and a relationship with the Jewish people. In other words, saying, of course, I love the Jewish people. What does that have to do with Israel? Do you agree with me that that may be what he's doing?
I absolutely do. I think that you can take the statement, anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism, and use it in a way to critique Israel, but also to hold Israel to certain standards that maybe Israelis themselves might feel impossible to live up to. Certainly, I think Pope Francis did feel a genuine friendship with the Jewish people. I would say some members of the Jewish side of dialogue felt that he was trying to kind of be friends with everyone, that friend who wants to kind of be on good terms with everyone that they interact with. Certainly, it was coming from a place of profound empathy and a hatred for suffering. But again, from the Jewish perspective, sometimes I think it came off as naive and perhaps reflecting a lack of comprehension when it comes to the extent to which many Jews view the war in Israel and Gaza as an existential war. I find that in general, it's hard to explain this to our Catholic partners. The numbers of Jews lost in the Holocaust have not been replenished. We are a tiny people. I think it's hard to convey that. And the existential piece was, for whatever reason, I think not effectively conveyed to Catholic leaders and to the papacy. Unfortunately, the language that was used to describe the war coming out from Catholic outlets was language of vengeance. And in turn, those Catholic outlets called for restraint. So, you Jews, you have to use restraint and not overdo it. We understand that what happened on October 7th was very bad, but now take the moral high ground and restrain yourselves. Because this was the framing, there was very little talk of the hostages. But again, I think when it comes to Pope Francis, I think that there was some self-contradiction in this regard, because there were times where he did mention the hostages and he met with the families of the hostages, but then he also met with Palestinians. And so there was a sense of trying to have the cake and eat it too.
It seems to me, and perhaps I'm going too far, but when you talk about these Christian news outlets describing Jewish vengeance against Hamas, that would appear to feed upon and perhaps even reinforce old Christian tropes about Jewish vengeance and Jewish attitudes. Would you agree?
Oh, yes, I would agree with that. I think that there was a description. We could see this very easily in the Jesuit news outlet, America Magazine. There was a statement published there, and you could find this online early on, within a couple months after October 7th, where there was a call for restraint that used terms such as retribution, vengeance. I started collecting these statements because the language to me was baffling, although maybe it should not have been baffling, because I think it also, there's a degree of self-affirmation when you say, look, we've told you that the Jews have this kind of quality that they need to suppress or control or restrain. I don't know to what extent it's self-aware, but there is a depiction of this war that I see not in all Catholic outlets, and not, it's not limited to Catholic outlets, certainly not, but there is kind of an impulse in some spaces of discourse to describe the war as a war of vengeance. Look, I'm not a policy expert, but I'm saying this from Skokie, Illinois, as an Orthodox Jew. It just doesn't resonate. Even if I were to critique the Israeli government, it doesn't. Certainly not in November 2023, it didn't resonate.
Yeah, and speaking from the ground here in Beit Shemesh, Israel, I can say that I know quite a few people who would be characterized as very right-wing, people with whom I disagree. And in their description of the war, I don't hear anybody describing it as a war of vengeance or revenge or punishment. Those are terms I only hear from people outside of the Jewish community. It just does not ring true. People have strong feelings about destroying Hamas entirely, but it's in order to make sure it never happens again, not because we need to punish them. That's something which just is not part of the dialogue and the discourse here, at least in my experience. Okay, I have one final question I want to ask you, which is again about Israel on some level. Prime Minister Netanyahu very obviously snubbed Pope Francis by waiting quite a while to offer condolences, and then afterwards offering somewhat tepid condolences. And afterwards, he sent the low-ranking official, relatively speaking, to Pope Francis's funeral. And he did this, obviously, to protest the Pope's statements about the war in Gaza. Still, I thought that Netanyahu was being extremely foolish. He was risking offending 1.4 billion Catholics to make a point, a valid point, I believe, but one that was simply not worth making, because I would think that most Roman Catholics have other things on their mind other than the Pope's opinions about Israel. And why distance all those people? Just suck it up, offer proper condolences, send a proper official. Do you think that I'm right? Or am I wrong and Catholics aren't thinking about it in these terms?
It's hard for me to answer this question because I don't have the details of what precisely happened. I did hear that there was an Israeli representative. I don't know the name of that representative or his exact rank. Of course,
I believe it was someone on the ambassadorial level rather than a prime minister or a president or a high-ranking official in the government.
Right. That's what I heard. Like you, I don't have the details either. The Jewish community of Rome, of course, did have representation. Their chief rabbi attended. And that to me says a lot because they had, I would say, some fraught communications in the past. So your question is, was it a mistake for Israel to not send a higher ranking? I mean, again, I'm not a policy expert. Yes, I think that's a huge mistake. I think it's a huge mistake. I don't know that I have so much more to say about it, but I think that this is a profoundly important relationship. Right now at this transitional time, I would think that Israel would see this moment as an opportunity. Now knowing what we know about this new Pope and the legacy of American cardinals and the work of Catholic Jewish dialogue specifically, now looking back on Pope Francis's funeral, it seems like a missed opportunity because we're at a moment now where I think some gestures would create a lot of goodwill. Not that it's all on the Jewish side. It also has to come from the Catholic side as well.
I'm on the same page, Malka, and it has been a pleasure speaking to a pseudo-colleague of the current Pope. Thank you for your insights. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Scott.
Subscribe to the Orthodox Conundrum podcast wherever you get your podcasts, and please rate it and write a review. Please visit jewishcoffeehouse.com for other episodes of the Orthodox Conundrum, as well as many other great podcasts, including Intimate Judaism, the Maimonides Minute, Chochmat Nashim, The Francisca Show, and Let My People Eat. I'd appreciate it if you go to Apple Podcasts and rate and review the Orthodox Conundrum. It takes literally 2 minutes. It's just giving a certain number of stars and writing 1 or 2 sentences. Please like the Orthodox Conundrum podcast on Facebook and join our growing Facebook group, the Orthodox Conundrum Discussion Group, where you can feel free to discuss issues in Orthodoxy in an honest and friendly environment. Finally, do you have a message that needs to get out? Do you want to promote your business, your organization, or your cause? The best way is by producing a podcast, and Jewish Coffee House can make it happen. I have experience producing hundreds of podcasts, both for myself and for satisfied clients. Whether you want to learn everything you need in one day, or relax and record and let me do the heavy lifting, Jewish Coffee House Productions will work with you to make it happen and make it even better than you imagined. Let me help you today. Write to me at scott@jewishcoffeehouse.com or go to jewishcoffeehouse.com, click on Productions, and sign up for a free consultation. Make your voice heard, promote your cause, sell your product, and engage an audience now. I'm Scott Kahn. This has been the Orthodox Conundrum on jewishcoffeehouse.com.